Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Historical fiction has always been fascinating for the fact that it presents the reader enveloped within the author's own imagination at work, as Elyse Durham's debut Maya and Natasha has, where the Los Angeles Times found that her careful writing about dualities feels like delicate choreography, and one that shelf awareness called a poignant debut that was heartrending, elegantly told, and full of fascinating detail about the worlds of professional dance and Soviet era daily life. Durham's novel is a stunning ballet of love, loss, and unbreakable loyalty, and she's here today to talk all about it. Elyse, welcome to the show. Now, most authors these days grow up influenced by a number of storytelling worlds, whether they're discovered in books or TV or movies or gaming or comics or so many other mediums. Which portals first really pulled you in and didn't let go?
Actually, it's funny you mentioned Star Wars because that was the first story that I fell madly in love with as a child. I The first novel I read at age 6 was actually, a Star Wars novel. It was called Children of the Jedi, and I still have it. It's in my bookcase downstairs. But I think what really interested me about those stories was the presence of myth and the idea that we're all part of this big story that we don't quite know the boundaries of. There's mystery and adventure involved. And I think all the books that I really love and the books that I try to write center really, really closely around plot and myth and story. Story is what made me fall in love with books. And I read a lot. I was one of those kids one time at the library at age 6. I checked out so many books that the librarian literally gave me a garbage bag to carry them all home in. But I just love story in all of its forms, whether it was, a film or a play or every single book I could get my hands on. The first person who comes to mind is my aunt. She was always sending us books, and I grew up in a big family. I was actually homeschooled, and sometimes we lived out in rural areas where it wasn't always easy to get books or to get to the library. It took a long time to pack all the kids into the car. So my aunt would mail us packages of books, and that's where I first encountered The Secret Garden and so many of the classics. And I was really grateful to her for that.
How young do you remember desire of your own to try writing growing out of that love of story?
The funny thing is I don't remember not writing. I know there must have been a point in time when I, couldn't pick up a pen and make words happen, but I truly don't remember that. I definitely journaled before fiction happened. One of my childhood friends just gave me a copy of a story I wrote for her when we were 7 about when we got stuck in a snowdrift, and I thought she looked like George Washington crossing the Delaware. Like, it's always been there.
How do you contrast that experience looking back versus, say, when you entered a more formal classroom studying for your MFA at Warren Wilson College?
I think being homeschooled was really good preparation for becoming a writer and a novelist because I had to discipline myself to stay at a desk all day. Of course, my parents would, guide us and direct us, but we were really self-taught and self-directed in many ways. And that takes a lot of discipline. So does writing a book because there's nobody standing over your shoulder saying, "Hey, have you finished that chapter yet?" It has to come from in here. So I learned the discipline that way. And it also got me used to the deep isolation of writing because you're by yourself a lot in both cases, and that was a good experience for me. I started out at a community college, a lot of homeschooled students do. Started actually when I was 16, and I had a professor in my honors program meet with me after the first paper was turned in, and he said, "Look, I always put students' papers into piles. There's there's okay, there's good. Your paper is in a pile by itself, and I need you to know this is something you need to take seriously and steward and really work on because I think you have a gift." And one of the things about being homeschooled is there's no one to compare yourself to. So to have someone say that to me that wasn't my mom, I love my mom very much and her support meant a lot, but it's different when it's someone who didn't raise you, right? So he really his name is Stephen Loizell, recently retired. He really shepherded me and directed me toward colleges with the writing programs, and then I eventually transferred to a liberal arts college called Kalamazoo College, and my undergrad advisor, Andy Mosina, was a huge influence too because he let me write a short novel for my senior project, and it was the same thing. It was me alone at my desk, occasionally turning in pages, having that feedback. It was exactly like what happens, with a writer and their editor, so that was great practice too.
So, was this deep dive into historical fiction your first into trying to get published, or did anything precede it in the way of dusty hard drive works?
I did have a memoir I was trying to write about, being a community college instructor and the colorful characters I encountered there, but it didn't really have legs, and I actually started writing this book when I was 30, so many years after undergrad, but it was just because I fell in love with ballet.
Now, ballet is universally regarded as one of the most rigorous and competitive sports across the world, especially in the time era you set this story against the Soviet Union, starting with the Vaganova Ballet Academy, exploring what Kirkus Review spotlighted as an operatic melodrama of a plot, boldly layered over a scaffolding of historical fact, where twins Maya and Natasha are about to graduate from the Theater Academy for the prestigious Kirov Ballet when big news arrives. The Kirov plans to bring on a few new dancers ahead of an upcoming European tour, but to hopefully prevent defection, only one member of a family can join. Everyone knows it'll be Natasha, the more gifted and popular sister, and no one can possibly imagine what's ahead in this novel's tornado of a plot. Durham provides an author's note confirming the truth of the historical detail underlying the drama. Exchange visits of Russian and American ballet companies were indeed underway when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke. Nearly all the details and characters involved here in the filming of the epic Soviet version of War and Peace come from life. Durham's storytelling bravado is buttressed by impressive proclamations. Totalitarianism really can bring out the worst in people, suggests this eye-catching debut. Wow. Please unravel where your initial fascination with ballet personally led you to in turn create Maya and Natasha. And as their characters came to life in a time of such political turmoil in the former Soviet bloc, how did you decide who it was going to impact?
I had a strange encounter with ballet. Most kids, were forced into it as children and then maybe they fall in love with it, maybe they don't. I first came to it as an adult. One of my favorite musicians, Sufjan Stevens, did a collaboration with Justin Peck of New York City Ballet. And they released this promotional video for it that was two dancers dancing in a kitchen. And it was the most unballet thing I could think of. Their hair was down, they were doing the dishes. And I had never seen movement like that before, and it was a song I'd heard 1,000 times, but I'd never actually seen it, and it felt like the notes had become movement. I was so fascinated by that. It was like the children's book when you give a mouse a cookie, like, if you let Elise watch ballet, she's gonna wanna try to dance and do it herself in classes, and then I loved classes so much that I had to start researching it, and through the research, I just became fascinated with the story of these dancers who they really loved their art, but it was state supported. It was supported by a totalitarian regime, and some of them left the country so they could have more artistic freedom. And I wanted to know, what did that look like? Was it worth the cost? Because you have to leave behind your friends and family. You're never really home again. But that was part of why they did it, and it really fascinated me. Maya and Natasha are twin sisters who were born during the siege of Leningrad in 1944, and they're immediately orphaned, and they grow up at the Vaganova at this ballet academy, and all they want is to become professional dancers, to dance at the Kirov like their late mom. And just at the end of their senior year, they find out they've just passed a new law and family members can't travel abroad together. So the Kirov will not hire groups of siblings. So now only one of them is going to get to live that dream they've both been sacrificing everything for so long. And to answer your question about the research, I I researched before I knew I was writing a book. I just kind of gathered everything I could about ballet and Soviet history, and a few years into this obsession realized, "Oh, a novel is happening. That's why I have piles of books all over my house about this." But I was really interested in the era in Soviet history known as the thaw, mostly the Khrushchev years, when things kind of eased up culturally a little bit. There was more artistic freedom, there were relaxed relations between the US and Russia for a little bit till the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I wanted to know, what did it look like to be someone who was born before that period happened and then was an adult after you went back to more totalitarian standards for artists? I really was fascinated by the idea of twins because I think every family has competition in it. And the people who have told me they've enjoyed this novel, a lot of them have said, I have a tough relationship with my sister, and that's what drew me to your book. But when we first meet them, we meet them when they're born in this really difficult situation. The Nazis are literally knocking on the door of the city. And then the book jumps forward to them at age 18 thinking they've got the whole world figured out. They're just going to do their best and dance and everything's going to work out. But I feel like none of us really get to live the reality we think we've discovered when we're 18. And that's true for them too. They suddenly realize they're going to have to grow up really fast and make difficult choices. When I'm working on any project with a historical setting, I'm always thinking about character first. So I love learning and I love all the historical details, but it's really easy to get lost in that and just include things even though they don't really apply to the plot or the characters or anything. So I was always thinking, how did this affect these people's lives? And the thing that surprised me the most is that people in this era, in this time and place, a lot of them really believed the way they were living and the Soviet ideology was going to make the world a better place, which is not something we hear about here on this side of the Cold War, we think of it as, everyone was being oppressed, everyone was brainwashed, everyone was just being forced to do things against their will. And there's some truth to that, and stereotypes exist for a reason. But truly, people thought they were more moral because they were Soviet communists. And that really astonished me. And when some Soviet ballet dancers came to the US, they were really surprised at how little the arts were funded here. They said they don't even have a state ballet. How can they possibly take themselves seriously as a country? Because that was so important to them. Now, of course, the shadow side of that is that there were a lot of personal freedoms exchanged. There was a lot of hypocrisy. There just thousands upon thousands of lives were lost because those ideologies took a really dark turn. But people thought they were doing the right thing. That really shocked me.
Who were some of the most fascinating real life historical figures you were able to cameo into the novel?
I really loved writing about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, Kennedy and Khrushchev are characters in this novel, very briefly, and learning about all of the high stakes elements of that story was actually really scary. I had no idea how close the world came to ending. We really owe all of our lives to a single Soviet submarine commander who said, "Wait, let's not do the bomb yet. Let's hold off on that button," because it really came very close. The world came very close to ending. But I just loved the ballet history as well. So George Balanchine is a character in this novel. He is the founder of New York City Ballet and kind of the father of American ballet. And a lot of his proteges and company are characters too. And I so admire people who have really, really long artistic careers. And I wanted to sink deeply into what does it look like to devote yourself to this and then have decades worth of work behind you. Sometimes your personal life suffers, turns out, but it was so fun to step into their imaginations.
In outlining such an expansive canvas to paint across over several generations, what did that process look like in action?
I tend to kind of write a first draft just blind and see what happens, and partly because I wanna see if there's enough material there to invest the time to do character arcs and mapping. But yes, eventually, I had huge charts covering my office walls that tracked every single character in a chapter, what was happening in Soviet history, what the weather was like, and this book spans, 40 years, 3 continents, and 4 countries, and I think about 45 named characters. So there was a lot of information to keep track of all the time, but that's what made it fun for me. If it hadn't been a challenge, it wouldn't have been fun. That was one of the hardest things to me about the book actually was figuring out where to limit and where in history to zone in because originally the book started with the Russian Revolution and went all the way to the 80s and I was like, "No, I need to cut back. I only have one life to live." Because I started with ballet and then became interested in mid-century ballet and Soviet Russian ballet. That was kind of my into Russia. I think one of the reasons that Eastern Europe is so interesting though is that it feels familiar. It feels like Western culture, but something's a little off. It's as if someone described Western culture to an alien who had never seen it and they tried to recreate it. And you're looking around like, okay, yeah, this looks like Italian architecture, okay, but there's onion domes, so it feels a little off and strange, and that's part of why it's so fascinating.
The Los Angeles Times spotlighted within their read and review of this debut a crucial moment when Maya and Natasha realize they'll be separated, and one betrays the other and causes a schism that echoes throughout the rest of their lives. Did you decide in advance or as you were writing and getting to know their personalities better and better, who would be the one to execute that betrayal?
I definitely saw them grow up, and that was the privilege of being an author. When I would refer to them to my husband, I'd call them my girls because I was with them from the moment they were born all through their adulthood. And that was one of the reasons that it was fun to set a book in this era of time because fashion was changing quite a bit and the standards of living in Soviet Russia were changing too, and then dramatically dropped off again as it hit this point in adulthood. So it's kind of like the scenes in Forrest Gump where you see him going through the 60s, you see the cultural markers change around him and who he is and his core remains the same. That's kinda how the girls were too. Yeah, the competition in this book was one of the plot elements I really struggled with the most because it had to be compelling enough to maintain tension, so you wanna see what happens, and not so obvious that you lose interest, like, "Oh, one sister's clearly way more talented than the other. There's no way the other one even has a chance of getting into the ballet." So I had to keep adjusting the circumstances so they're kind of equally matched by the time you get to the end of, the first part of the book, and that's the tension. It's that they're really strong bond of love, that sisterly love is being tested, and they both have to make really tough decisions about what's most important to me in my life. What am I willing to sacrifice for my ambition? And what really is the core of who I am? And they both make a lot of mistakes, but I think there's hope in there at the end of the book that things are going to turn out okay, but it's a little rough getting there. It was very difficult because I wanted to let those twists happen, but also keep readers rooting for them. And that was something I was really interested in as a novelist. How do you let people make terrible mistakes, but still engender compassion for them? So, one of the themes of the book is sisterhood and the ways that women support each other, and also the ways they're trained to turn on each other. Women are raised to believe that there's not enough in the world to go around. And if you want to get ahead, you're going to have to step on other people, specifically other women, along the way.
Yikes.
That's exactly the right yes, it is yikes. It is not a good thing that this is the way the world is. But they find their way through it, and they find their way back to each other.
When they did find their way back to each other, did you view that as the start of their next chapter, i.e., maybe a sequel in this journey?
I feel like I've told the story as it is. There are still several, decades left in Soviet history, so theoretically, there could be more pieces to pick up.
What have marked any of your favorite moments in the book's release so far?
That moment when, um I found out the book was getting published was unforgettable. I mean, how could you possibly forget that? I still remember seeing the 1994 Little Women movie when Joe finds out, "Oh my gosh, I'm an author, I'm getting published," and that was kind of a core memory for me as a child, so have it replicated as an adult was really powerful. I also one of the first things I did when the book sold was wrote thank you notes to every library I'd gone to as a child. Because they really formed me. They gave me access to literature and the world outside of my home. So I wrote all these thank you notes, and the main library that I went to as a kid invited me back to do a reading, and that I just instantly started bawling when I read that because it felt full circle, like the same place where I used to pick up the Caldecott and Newbery Award winners. I'm gonna be standing next to those same books and reading from my books, so that's really special too.
Lastly, what have you found useful within your own writing travels you could share with the aspiring author, sitting where you were before your first book was published?
Anyone who wants to write, I would say you have to be faithful to a practice. And if it's 50 minutes a day, if it's 5, that's really where the heart of the work is just sitting at your desk and doing it. And there's no magic formula, and there's nothing that makes it easier. Anytime you face a blank page, it's going to be equally terrifying, no matter how many you've written before, but it's joyful work and we're very honored to do it.
Elyse, it's been wonderful speaking today. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Yeah, it was great to meet you, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom about the writing life.